Hey everyone, Cynics here, and it's time for another episode of PAINTOVER PALS. That's my little critique series where I take some of my patrons' artwork and just do little paintovers. Anyway, I was feeling a bit under the weather when I did these paintovers, so they're not my best, wah wah, but hopefully you'll still enjoy them, so let's dive right into it. First up is AC, who gave me this rooster-looking creature. Is that a cockatrice? I don't know, maybe. Anyway, the background is really loud and kind of chaotic, and it's messing with my whole vibe. We never want a background that's super saturated or has weird gray and black spots going on. I don't know what that's supposed to be, but we're just gonna knock out the background, keep it nice and simple. After that, we can focus on our design. Now, I think what we really need to improve on is shapes and colors. So the silhouette can be improved upon in its shape. You can see the whole little crown of our rooster here. It just has a lot of noodly shapes that are very similar in size, so we want to put on a bit of a stronger shape to them. A little bit of angle and a little bit of shape hierarchy. So we'll try to get some big, medium, small going on, and that should help out a little bit. Moving on to everything else, I feel like you tried to render a little bit too early on. So instead of trying to add shading and highlights, let's really break things down back to the basics and make sure things work with nice, good, solid shapes and colors. One thing I would like to mess around with is perhaps getting rid of that dark blackish color and bringing in a cooler blue, which is a nice little cartoony substitute anytime you have a really strong black color. That'll give us a nice mix of warm tones and cool tones, which is definitely something we always want. You have some scribbly kind of white areas anywhere where you have some, I guess, scaly texture, and we're just going to dial that back also. We can add in a bit of texture, but we don't want it to be too messy. We want it to be very confident. Anyway, I tried some different approaches for how we can spread out the tail a little bit more so it wasn't just coming in back on itself. But in the end, I think if I had to redesign this little creature, I would try to focus way more on the shape dynamics. So we can really bring in maybe the bulkiness of the chest area, make it feel a lot more rooster-like, and then shrink in the other areas to be more in flow with that. Lots of very big and confident shapes. Anyway, I guess that's going to pretty much do it for this one. Remember, just shapes, colors, keep to the basics, keep it dynamic, and you should be fine. You can always render out stuff in the end, but give yourself a nice base to work with. Next up, we have Brian, who is still on his journey to become the next Cynics. I know you're coming for me, Brian. Anyway, let's see what we can help with this time. It looks like faces are coming along a little bit. Some of the poses are looking a little stronger this time. There's been a constant improvement. First thing I'll point out is this eyebrow on the left face, because it feels like your eyebrow is following the actual eye instead of the eye socket. We always want to make sure the eyebrow is following along the ridge of the eye socket and not just the eye itself. That would be pretty weird looking. After that, I feel like the nostrils are just separating the septum too much. Once again, you could always go back and look at my quick tips anatomy for noses, but just bring in the nostrils into a little bit more of a contained thing. We don't want them to look like they're just way out there and up in the open, or else it looks like they have no nose. There's a lot of ways you can do it, but I'll just keep it very simple for my little paintover. After that, I'll just start messing with some of the face proportions. They're getting closer, but I still feel like you're sometimes diminishing the chin a little too much, and maybe just making the noses a little too weird in shape. So still focus on the nose shapes, just make sure the whole face feels pretty structured and strong. Let's see, what else do we got? Necks are definitely an issue. You want to make sure those tendons on the necks are not crossing all the way across and that they come down to some kind of point between the collarbones. And I also tried to get rid of that really pinched angle on the side of the face. You never want angles that feel too acute. We want to keep things very obtuse in order to make things look good. Psychra might disagree with that one, but everyone knows he's a cutie. Anyway, I think the neck was also looking a bit too long, so we can just shrink in that just a little bit. I don't even think I shrunk it enough, but you're getting closer to the right idea, so we'll just work on those necks and everything. It looks like you did it right in some parts, so I don't know why that one was so weird. The last thing I'll say is to just thicken up those hair chunks. You don't want too many little strands. You want to combine as much stuff into singular chunks as you can. The next painting I have for you guys is by Mace, and this is also quite a nice painting. There's a lot of skill going on here. One of the main critiques I have for this piece is that the background is just nebulous and cloudy and chaotic, and it doesn't really help our character at all. In fact, it really takes away from the character because it has so much chaos. I didn't even notice, but you have little feathers floating around and they just get lost in that chaos of a background. So step one is definitely going to be to tone back the background. Don't do stuff that doesn't help to serve the graphical purposes of your main foreground element. Also, it felt like that knee was weirdly in the grayish tones despite being seemingly coming toward camera. So I don't know if there was a reason for that, but I just tried to make it a little bit darker so it matched the distance from the camera. Okay, the second main concern I have for this is just the amount of colors going on. There are a lot of colors. There's reds and yellows and greens and purples and pretty much everything, and they're all trying to fight with each other. But you know, maybe that's what the art director wants, or maybe that's what the character is, or whatever. Sometimes you gotta do it, so I'll not change it too much. I don't know. I messed around with the color values and balances a little bit, but overall, I still kind of left it because I didn't want to change anything that maybe wasn't supposed to be changed. But I started making some minor tweaks. I twisted the face a little bit. It felt slightly out of perspective. And speaking of out of perspective, I feel like the whole arm and crossbow coming toward us feels a bit off. It feels like the arm is actually very short and stubby. So I think that will be my main other crit, is to just kind of mess with that angle and proportion on that arm a little bit. It just doesn't quite read as well as it could. So without redoing the whole part, I tried to do a quick fix. It's not that great, but hopefully it at least highlights what I was talking about. Sadly, that wing behind it is producing some unfortunate tangents, but we can't fix everything. Well, I mean, I guess we could, but we didn't. Alright, let's keep this chugging along. Next up, we have this little skeleton warrior looking guy by Marcos, and I think the first thing I really wanted to change was his spine. In fact, this whole like belt thing, I don't know, it's weird in my brain because I'm like, what's his belt holding on to? Because there's not really anything there. But who knows, we can at least curve his spine a little bit. We never want the spine to feel too straight. After that, I guess there's a few things we can mess with. For one, his arm on his, I guess his left arm, the one on our right side, is super short compared to the other one. The one on that's holding the sword, it's like twice as long. So we can just mess with that, make his arm a lot longer. It'll probably look fine anyway. I also wanted to mess with the rendering style of the arms because they felt very out of place. They just looked like brown and muscly. We can still leave in some tendons and muscles, but I want to make them look more skeletal. So we'll just make it look like worn out tendons attached to skeleton arms. I think that'll fit the character a little better. There's definitely plenty of surface details we could add in. On things such as his boots, I feel like there could be a seam down the side. That whole area just along the bottom of the boot and everything, it just felt very empty, so we can add a couple little details there. I think you did a pretty good job with the metal. The cape in the back could use a little bit more graphic designness to it, so we can just bump up some of the graphic design appeal, make some of the shapes a bit chunkier, make some of the cutouts a bit more raggedy. Just make sure the graphics of it really complement the rest of the character. Before we had that tangent just coming along the pauldron armor, so we want to make sure everything has its own shapes and angles to it. That sword over there is kind of fading into the background, so if we pop on a little bit of highlight on there, now when you blur your eyes, you can at least see it fitting into the piece a bit more. Alright, just a couple more important things to go. I feel like the rib cage was very low, and while I'm too lazy to redraw all the metal and everything, it would be good to at least try to move it up a little bit higher somehow, whether you wanted to repaint that or something. But it would definitely look good if it was a little higher. I forgot to mention, but I also added a little bit more shadows in different parts. A little bit more ambient occlusion can go a long way in pushing the shadows and depth of everything. Lastly, I'll just redo his head a bit because the head was feeling a little bit boring. I didn't like how low the nose bone was, and or I should say the nose opening. So just bringing that up, making it look slightly more realistic, but still keeping all the features and kind of function that you had going. I'm just doing what I think looks a little stronger, maybe a little better. Alright, let's wrap this one up. I do appreciate that he had a nice simple gradiated background in there. It just looked nice and clean. A good presentation goes a long way. Next up is Naufel with this Deadpool painting. The first note I could make is to just make sure you watch your stroke economy a little bit. You don't want it to look like different strokes are just glazing over other strokes, because that's a very flattening thing in people's brains. So just make sure each color and value has its own little area to play in, and it's not just randomly glazing everything else. Aside from that, things are looking pretty good. Just cleaning that stuff up. I don't know if you're completely done with this one, but there's still plenty of room for surface details here. Especially in things like the masks and the seams, and just every little detail can be brought to the next level. In case you're wondering, like, how can I make this thing better? There's plenty of room for surface detailing in there, and you especially want to make sure you save all your good surface details for the areas of interest, such as the face and everything. Right now it feels like all the metal stuff is a little more rendered and attention grabbing than the whole face area, so if you can find a way to bring up that level of detail, that's always a good thing. Aside from that, I guess I don't have the best advice for this one. Just try to watch out for having a warm character on a warm background. Everything's kind of in this warm range, and it would have been a little bit nicer, although you do have that little glow of blue, which is very nice. But still, the brownness of the background, you could have brought in maybe some slightly cooler tones. Once again, just making sure you have a good balance of warm and cool tones. Alright, still, it's not my best paint over, but sorry about that. Next up, we have Sam, who gave me this little grumpy, sassy looking tree guy. I think there's a lot of compositional issues that can be fixed, first of all. We got this guy, he's way off to the side, but the hill he's on is really the only dark area, him and the hill. So the eye just kind of falls down from the top and just pours off the side because all the dark tones are just kind of falling off to the side. So you want to make sure that your eyes are pooling more in the middle, that there's more stuff to look at and not just dark tones running toward the corners. Now, if they weren't so light, I think your mountains in the background could be a secondary point of interest, but unfortunately they're also at the exact same height as our little tree guy over there. So we don't want things that share the same height on the page as well as the same size. It just kind of makes for a very flat and boring composition. Aside from that, if we wanted to completely redo things, we'd probably have to move our guy a little more toward the right. I don't know, somewhere closer to the third mark, wherever the center of his face is. We could bring that to one of the thirds. Alright, but without changing any of the composition, let's just do a straight paint over and see how much stuff we can fix. So first up, once again, we can make the mountains in the background a lot darker. Even if they're snowy mountains, they'll still be a much darker tone than the sky. I'll lower them down just a bit so they're not at the same height as the face. Overall, the colors on this image are very much in this cool green tone, and they're pretty much in that same tone from top to bottom. So I think bringing it more into a warmer range might actually help. So I'm just going to do that. Maybe it's personal preference, but I like these warmer greens more than these colder greens. And I think it'll work better with the bluer background as well. The foliage of the tree was definitely too light. It needs to be a lot darker. There's a lot of just light getting lost inside canopies of trees, so it gets really dark in there. And then you can add pops of highlight as you find the light source and everything. But start really dark, and anytime you're doing bushes and trees, which by the way we can add some here and there, always use pretty dark and strong colors. There's plenty of surface details we can add to the grass and the ground and just make our guy stand out a little bit more with little tufts of grass, a little bit of extra color, a little bit of tinier details to keep away from just all these big shapes. And even the light that's hitting our little tree guy, that can be a little bit more saturated, so we can really bring in those warm tones. And like I said, bringing in warm tones next to cool tones, it's a great way to make a better looking composition. Overall, just all the levels could be cranked up a little bit. Anywhere where we might have shadow, we can just bring in those dark tones. I feel like if we really want this tree to be sassy and grumpy, we gotta give him some bushy eyebrows. So I'm just gonna add that just for fun, just because I feel like he needs some little eyebrows going on. And maybe the last thing I can add are just some foreground elements, maybe just a little bit of depth going on. Some birds in the sky might form a nice little triangle between our points of interest, so that could be good as well. Just lead our eye around the page just a little bit. Overall, it's still not the best composition, but at least we tried to make it as appealing and interesting as we could in a short amount of time. Anyway, let's move on to our very last image of this episode, and that is this painting by Zafira. Also, a pretty good painting. So, let's see. The thing that jumps out to me, first of all, is the hair being super cloudy, nebulous. It's just very blurry and kind of messy looking. That doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but it feels very out of place in terms of the detail of everything else. So I'm just going to quickly redo those hair areas. I'm going to start with very loose and cloudy shapes, but I'm going to focus a little bit more on the big chunks of shadow and value, and then work in some maybe darker and lighter details. So once again, starting with big soft shapes and just adding some hard edges here and there afterward to bring in some texture. The arms could probably also use a little bit more shape. They feel very simple and just round and stick-like. There's always a little bit of muscle definition. No matter how skinny someone is, you can always see a little bit of the forms turning. I don't know what else is good for the body. I tried to detail the hands, but just doing it, I don't know. It was hard to make it look pretty when it doesn't really match the level of anything else. So instead of that, I did make sure to get rid of some of the dark contrast parts that were around the edge of the page, even if that was, maybe it's referenced, I don't know. But that dark area along the bottom is just too much contrast for an area that's leading you off the page. Keep the focus right in the middle. And speaking of the middle, let's see if we can improve the face just a little bit. The eyes could certainly use just a little bit more tighter detail and maybe some reflections. The eyes are really the singular point where you want to get the most detail. If you just have to do one thing, you do the eyes because that's where people tend to look. They tend to engage even a drawing with the eyes. So a little bit of extra detail there will go a long way. Also, anywhere where you have a sharp plane change, you can bring in a little bit of brighter value along that plane change. It'll just make things pop a little bit more. It'll kind of be like a little reflected bounce light going on. So it's realistic and it just adds a little bit more life to things. I don't know if you can see it that well, but I added a little just touch of that around the eye socket area. Anyway, the lips were looking a little too bright and they had a weird crease right in the middle. So I just wanted to fix the shape a little bit more, bring in a little bit more depth of value. Just make them darker. It feels a little bit more realistic to me anyway. And I think that's pretty much it. I tried to explore adding little hints of imperfections in the skin if you really want to get into realism touches. But I didn't want to spend a bunch of time trying to render out everything to make it realistic. So you can just use your imagination and think if you wanted to spend a ton of time, you can add in all kinds of imperfections on the skin and really make things look realistic. Okay, but I guess that's gonna pretty much do it for this episode. So once again, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sorry, not everything was as good as it could have been, but you know, there's still plenty to learn in there. I would like to give a huge thank you to everyone for watching this video and a special extra huge thank you to everyone that supports these videos via Patreon. So thank you everyone, and I hope you're having a good month so far. Alright, see ya everyone.